Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming today. We're excited to see a lot of attendees for our mostly monthly Resilient Speaker series. First, I want to say, since I know many of you will ask, that we will provide a copy of the slides in the chat. Also, if you'd like a certificate of attendance, you'll find a link to that once you complete the evaluation. We'll provide a link to the evaluation toward the end of today's program. Also, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat and feel free to add any questions you may have in the chat. My name is Wallace Dixon, and I serve as the founding director of the ETSU Strong Brain Institute. Now in its sixth year, the Strong Brain Institute works to apply the science of childhood adversity to prevent and mitigate the negative impacts of adverse childhood experiences on both children and adults. We also strive to promote awareness and adoption of resilience-informed practices and policies across ETSU and throughout the Appalachian Highlands region. One of the ways that we advance these objectives is through information dissemination, most notably via our Speaker Series platform. Today, we're proud to present to you our 36th Speaker Series presentation since its inception. If I'm trying to recall, I think Chelsea was our very first speaker 34 speakers ago. Today, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Chelsea Robertson as our guest speaker today. Chelsea received her PhD in experimental psychology from East Tennessee State University in 2021, where I had the privilege of working with her as a graduate student. She is currently an assistant professor of psychology at the Community College of Baltimore County, where she teaches introductory and developmental psychology. Her professional interests include trauma-informed teaching and effective teaching practices in the post-secondary classroom. And so with that, it's my pleasure to turn the platform over to Chelsea for today's presentation, From Surviving to Thriving, Neurodiversity, Trauma, and Resilience.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. Let me get this going here. Can you all see my slides? Perfect. Thank you so much. Alrighty, so as Dr. Dixon said, I am Chelsea Robertson. I teach at the Community College of Baltimore County in Maryland. And the reason why I wanted to present on this is because in my current role, I have a lot of students who are neurodivergent. I run into a lot of students with this particular identity every semester. And this was something that I wanted to personally research just to get a little bit more well-versed in this particular area. So what I wanted to talk about today is, first of all, what is neurodiversity? What is trauma? What is the relationship between neurodiversity and trauma? What is resilience? And then how can you promote resilience in neurodiverse individuals? So asking a lot of questions today. So the very first question is, what is neurodiversity? This is where it gets a little tricky. Going to start off a little tricky here. There's no single definition. There's no official definition that we can work from. However, there is kind of this understanding of what it is, even though there are many definitions out there. It's the general idea that no two brains are the same and that differences are the result of natural variation in the human genome, and that should be celebrated. This is a relatively recent movement that has really taken this idea of having different brain types and celebrating those differences instead of saying, oh, well, you have a deficit, you have something wrong with you. This term actually comes from the term biodiversity, which means that our ecosystems and our natural world just has natural variation. And we have taken that term and we now talk about it in terms of our brain types. I really enjoy this quote here. The human brain is as diverse as the human fingerprint. And this was said by Victoria McGovern. This is one of those quotes where you can kind of appreciate just how diverse we are working with the human genome. We're working with different brain types. Kind of moving on a little bit here. What does it mean to be neurodivergent? So we talked about neurodiversity, but let's talk about what it means to be neurodivergent. This is a person whose brain diverges from the majority. This is the opposite of neurotypical. So you might have heard of this term neurotypical before. Neurotypical just means that your brain works the same way or very similar to most other people's. If you are neurodivergent, you are someone whose brain diverges from this majority. This neurodivergence can be genetic, the result of brain altering experience, or a combination of the two. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a moment. In the neurodiversity sphere, we have something called the neurodiversity umbrella. There isn't really an agreed upon official list of who is considered neurodivergent. It would be really nice if there was such a list, but there just isn't. When we talk about psychology and we talk about the diversity of the human experience, it's just impossible to have one single definition to encapsulate everyone's experience. However, when we talk about the neurodiversity umbrella, we have different views as to who belongs under this umbrella and who does not, who is not in part of this neurodiversity umbrella. Some of the more common disorders and conditions that we hear about that are part of the neurodiversity umbrella are autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. You've probably heard of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. We have sensory processing disorder, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, intellectual disability, and many others. It could be a whole presentation just talking about the different identities that could fall under the neurodiversity umbrella, but these are some of the more common identities that we see under this umbrella. We actually know that because the definition is so broad, when we talk about who falls under this umbrella, we're talking about 15 to 20% of the population. That's kind of a generous number in terms of, out of 100 people, we're looking at 15 to 20 of them being part of this definition. But that's simply because neurodiversity encapsulates all of the different human experiences that we can have. Moving on a little bit, let's talk about trauma for a moment. So just like with neurodiversity, there's not really one singular definition that I can point you to. However, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration came up with what is known as the 3 E's of trauma. This is where we see that trauma results from an event that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So that's kind of a lengthy definition, but basically we're talking about an event that you experience that has some sort of negative effect on you. That's going to be the general idea of what trauma is. The thing about defining trauma is that if you ask 100 people what their definition is, you're going to get 100 different definitions. But this is generally what it boils down to, an event that is experienced that has some sort of negative effect on you. In terms of neurodiversity and trauma, trauma and neurodivergence are often discussed as separate entities, but they frequently overlap in ways that can deeply impact well-being. When we talk about trauma, we have to talk about neurodiversity. When we talk about neurodiversity, we also have to talk about trauma. There's also a pretty significant overlap between these two. Speaking with some of my clinical friends, so my friends who are in clinical psychology, this is one of those tasks that they have that can be very challenging to decipher. Is it someone who is dealing with trauma? Is it someone who is dealing with neurodivergence? Could it be both? Could it be neither? So when we talk about neurodiversity, we could be talking about things like differences in social communication, repetitive behaviors or needs for routine, hyperfocus, all sorts of things. When we talk about trauma, we could be talking about the avoidance of reminders of trauma, emotional numbing or dissociation, or heightened fear responses. But then in the middle, when we talk about both, we could be talking about hyperactivity, concentration difficulties, distraction difficulties, disorganization, sleep difficulties, restlessness, emotional dysregulation, social withdrawal, and fatigue and burnout. And those are just a couple of the symptoms on either side of this equation. And then even fewer, I limited my list here in terms of what could be both. So this is going to be the job of clinicians and people who work in mental health services to really be able to decipher, is it neurodiversity, trauma, or could it be both? Despite this overlap, trauma diagnosis is often overlooked within neurodiverse individuals, and neurodiversity is often overlooked in people who have experienced trauma. So if you come into a practice and you already have a neurodivergent identity sort of pinned on you, it might be difficult for people to also pin the trauma aspect on you. Same thing for having trauma. If you have a traumatic past, and you go in to be assessed for neurodivergence, they might say, oh, that's just the trauma. Um, it's a little bit more complicated than it initially seems. We actually know that within children, neurodivergent children experience trauma at the same percentage and often higher as neurotypical children. Um, for example, we know that the PTSD rate in autistic individuals is 45%. Not to say that autistic individuals are the only people who are neurodivergent, as we talked about. There are many identities that fall under the neurodivergent umbrella. But this is just one of the more salient forms of neurodivergence that people are often familiar with. So 45% in autistic individuals, whereas the rate for the general population is only around 4%. So something interesting is going on there, but not a whole lot of research has been dedicated to this particular area. We also know that autistic children show a greater increase in cortisol in the result of experiencing stressors. So cortisol is going to be a stress hormone that is released whenever you are experiencing a stressful or traumatic situation. And so we know that autistic kids are going to experience more of that cortisol dump almost. This is going to result in more intense and quick trauma reactions than in neurotypical individuals. So that's going to be a very important point moving forward, knowing that these kids are going to turn into adults who still have autism, who still have this particular condition, who have this neurobiological difference within them. Moving on a little bit, when we talk about trauma, we can talk about one particular type of trauma that is very, very important to talk about. This is going to be ACEs or adverse childhood experiences. I know for a lot of you who have been part of this resilience series before, you're probably very well familiar with ACEs. But for those of you who are not, adverse childhood experiences include traumatic events prior to the age of 18. So right when development is at its peak, when we are developing the brain, when we are developing all of the bodily systems. This can include things like abuse, so physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. We can talk about neglect, so physical and emotional neglect, and then household dysfunction, so household mental illness, incarceration, domestic violence, mental illness, all sorts of conditions there. We actually know that autistic children are more likely to experience ACEs than their neurotypical peers. And that's going to be a very interesting point moving forward. It's not really known as to why these kids experience more ACEs. It just means that that correlation is there and more research has to be done in order to determine that particular difference that we see between neurotypical and neurodiverse children. We also know that kids with ADHD are reported to have higher rates of each ACE than children without ADHD. So it's not just unique to autism, it's going to be unique to the neurodiversity sphere that we're talking about here. In terms of trauma that neurodiverse individuals experience uniquely, we can talk about how neurodivergent people often experience the world in ways that heighten their vulnerability to trauma. If you can imagine yourself as being a neurodiverse individual, or maybe you are yourself, you can imagine that the world is probably not designed for you in ways that it should be. Being told that you are less than, you're lacking, you're odd, you're weird, you're just different, and that something within you needs to be fixed or cured can and often does create trauma. It can build up over time. It doesn't have to be this one singular event that is super traumatic for you. It can be this culmination of all of these little micro traumas, these little T traumas that we build up over time that can really create havoc within our brain and our nervous system. We also know that the degree to which neurodiverse people experience bullying and isolation tends to be much higher than the general population. This is going to highlight a particular trauma that is experienced by neurodiverse individuals known as social exclusion. So, of course, social exclusion is going to be negative for all of us who experience it at one point or another. But when you are neurodiverse, you experience that not only more often, but to a heightened extent. And so, when we talk about the social exclusion, we talk about being constantly left out of group activities, having a lack of reciprocal friendships. So maybe you see someone as a really good friend and they just see you as an acquaintance. That could be very harmful for someone who experiences that pretty often. Being ignored, talked over, or infantilized. So imagine that someone with autism spectrum disorder discloses that they have ASD to an employer, and their employer suddenly doesn't give them any sort of responsibility. They say, oh, we'll let someone else handle it who can handle it a little better than you. That's infantilization. Experiencing peer avoidance due to being different, and then not experiencing true belonging, only token inclusion. So we're going to include you because we just kind of feel like we should, but not because we really want to. That's going to be something that neurodiverse individuals experience to a heightened degree. They're always going to be seen as other to a lot of other people. They're always going to be seen as different or being seen as odd. We can also talk about sensory overwhelm. So many neurodivergent people experience the world through heightened sensory perception. So environments that are loud, bright, crowded, or unprepared can be really overwhelming and distressing. When we talk about something as simple as I was thinking in my office the other day, there was a leaf blower being blown, and I could totally ignore it. It didn't bother me whatsoever, but I could imagine if I had a neurodiverse student in one of my office hours, that could really bother them. That could be almost like an assault to their sensory processing. This is especially the case when these experiences are frequent or unavoidable. So something like in a classroom, something like in the work environment. This can especially be the case if you are not believed. If you tell people, hey, that leaf blower is really bothering me, people will just say, oh, you can get over it. It's just a sound. You'll block it out eventually. Neurodiverse individuals may not be able to block it out as easily as neurotypical people can. And then finally, we can talk about masking. So, neurodiverse specific trauma in relation to masking, this basically means so when we talk about masking, we're talking about sustained efforts to appear neurotypical. We're talking about efforts to seem as though you are not neurodiverse. So, what can this look like? This can include suppressing stimming or self-regulatory behavior. So, a lot of neurodiverse people will fidget and they will kind of like jiggle their leg, or they'll be fumbling with something in their hands. They might be seeing that as, oh, I've got to hide that. That's something that I shouldn't be doing as a person in society. I need to be able to blend in with other people. Rehearsing scripts for conversation, not something as simple as, oh, well, I want to talk about this with my coworker tomorrow, but actually mapping out, here's how I'm going to say hello. Here's going to be how I ask how their weekend went. These are going to be the topics that I feel comfortable preparing ahead of time so that I can talk to my coworker. Monitoring facial expressions, tone, posture, and eye contact, and then hiding sensory distress or executive functioning difficulties. So, doing something as simple as, keeping an eye on your facial expression. Am I smiling enough? Am I looking in their eye well enough? Am I using the right tone? Am I doing all of these things to appear neurotypical? That might be something that neurotypical people do to some extent to show that they're being attentive and that they're showing interest in a particular topic. But for neurodiverse individuals, this is something that really takes up a lot of mental airspace. The idea here is that visibility equals danger. So if I show that I am neurodiverse, this could be dangerous for me. Maybe not in the sense of like I'm physically in danger, although that could be something that some people experience. But it's almost like a social danger where I've got a camouflage to be able to fit in with other people. That's essentially what it boils down to. So where do we go from here? We know that neurodiverse individuals experience more trauma. They experience more rates that they experience higher rates of PTSD. Um, what exactly do we do with this information? We can promote resilience in neurodiverse individuals. And just like when we talked about the definition for trauma and we talked about the definition for neurodiversity, there are many definitions. Again, you could ask 100 people what it means to be resilient, and you'll get about 99 different definitions. But the overarching idea here is that it is maintaining well-being or bouncing back from difficult experiences. You might have heard of the term lacing up your bootstraps. That might be something that resonates with you. We know that protective factors are well studied in the general population, but relatively little is known of these factors in the neurodiverse population. There's some pockets of research every now and there when we look at building resilient and neurodivergent individuals, but most of the research has been done on people who are neurotypical or people who are not outwardly identifying as being neurodiverse. So we know that resilience can be built by facilitating internal factors like emotional regulation, social skills, or self-esteem. But it's really important to know that resilience does not solely reside within an individual. It's also largely determined by an individual's social supports and environment. And that's kind of the view that I take. There might be people who disagree with that particular idea, but I believe that a lot of resilience comes from the social supports that people have. And so that's going to be the focus of the rest of my presentation today. Um, I like to imagine it. I heard this analogy when the SBI was very young a couple years ago. The idea that, when you're on an airplane and they tell you put your mask on before helping other people, it's kind of this idea that we need to be able to help ourselves, but also helping other people at the same time. So that's the idea that I sort of live by with this information. One way to promote resilience in individuals is by using SAMHSA's 6 pillars of trauma-informed care. So this is something that, again, people who are veterans of the SBI and the Resilience series, you've probably heard of these 6 pillars before. But when we talk about building resilience, I really like using this framework because it's not this idea that I'm going to give you this checklist of things that you should do in order to become trauma informed, in order to become welcoming to neurodiverse individuals. It's this idea that we have these pillars that are more like guidestones to help us sort of rethink our interactions with other people and to help guide us along the way. These 6 pillars are guidelines for trauma-informed care, which benefit all individuals, but not just those with trauma backgrounds and not just those who are neurodiverse. These pillars are going to be good for anybody, regardless of their background, regardless of their neurodiversity status, regardless of their trauma status. So when we talk about the 6 pillars of trauma-informed care, first we can talk about safety. So this is where you promote physical and psychological safety. I'm going to go into more detail over each of these pillars here in a moment, but this is just a brief overview of what the 6 pillars are. Trustworthiness and transparency. So you build transparency to build trust. Peer support, you allow peers to support one another. You encourage collaboration through collaboration and mutuality. Empowerment, voice, and choice. So you recognize power differentials and promote empowerment, voice, and choice. And then you actively dismantle oppressive systems. So for the first pillar, we've got safety. So this is the idea where you promote safety not only in terms of physical safety, but also psychological safety. You provide agendas in advance, if at all possible. You let people know, hey, here's going to be what we're talking about and in what order. Offer quiet rooms and permission to step out without penalty. So being able to tell people you can step out whenever you're needing to. We're not going to talk bad about you as soon as you step out. You're not going to miss anything important. We're going to allow you to take a break whenever necessary. Creating sensory considerate environments such as lighting, noise, and seating. So giving people choice in terms of, do I want to sit in the brighter part of the room or the darker part of the room? Do I want a room that is a little bit more quiet, where I can wear headphones, for example? Or do I want to be in the really social environment that the meeting is taking place in? And then seating. Do you allow people to sit wherever they feel most comfortable, or do you have it pre-planned for people? And then finally, building predictable routines with clearly signaled transitions and warnings before changes. Instead of being in a meeting and saying, okay, now we're going to suddenly switch to this completely other topic, you can tell people, okay, so we're going to spend about 10 minutes doing this, and then we're going to transition to talking about this other topic. But we're going to make it clear ahead of time what we're doing to make those transitions a little bit easier for neurodivergent people. Then we have transparency. So this is where you operate with transparency and you operate with this idea that I'm going to be as clear as possible whenever I can be. We know that not everyone can be transparent all of the time just because some information has to be kept private. But when you can be transparent, absolutely to be transparent. So you can explain processes, decisions, and expectations clearly and in advance. So I think of me being a professor, I can give grading rubrics, evaluation criteria, performance metrics, all of those things ahead of time so that students know, hey, this is going to be how I'm graded. Same thing for an employer. Giving the metrics to an employee. Here's going to be how I evaluate you at the end of the year, at the end of the quarter, whatever. Following through consistently on stated policies. This is a pretty big one. So if you have a policy that says X, Y, or Z, you need to follow that policy X, Y, or Z. If you don't follow it, then maybe think about how you can change that particular policy. Communicate changes as early as possible and acknowledge disruptions openly. So if I am supposed to cover chapter 5 in class one day, but for some reason I need to cover chapter 6, I would send my students an email ahead of time saying, hey, I know that we were supposed to do this. We now have to do this because of X, Y, and Z. I'm not going to just show up in the middle of class and say, oh, by the way, guys, we're now going to cover this. That can be really disrupting for everyone, but especially for neurodivergent individuals. This can be a hard one for some people, so avoiding sarcasm, indirect feedback, or testing social awareness. This can be very challenging for neurodivergent individuals because a lot of neurodivergent individuals struggle with things like sarcasm and indirect communication. So keeping that in mind is going to be very important when working with those individuals. And then minimize hidden rules or ambiguous social expectations. So something like, I've heard of people working at companies where it's sort of expected that you put in overtime. It's not written anywhere, nor is it ever said aloud, but you are expected to put in some overtime. That can really miss the mark when it comes to, again, everybody, but especially for neurodivergent individuals. Or something like, on Fridays, it's kind of expected that you go out and have drinks with your coworkers. It's not written down anywhere. Can't imagine where that would be written down, but it's not really communicated. It's something that you're just supposed to pick up on. That can be very challenging for neurodiverse individuals. Then we have peer support. So encouraging mentorship or peer-led support systems, using group norms that allow silence, asynchronous participation, or text-based discussion. This has been a really big one since COVID, I would say. This is the idea that communication can take a bunch of different forms. It's not going to just be the people who are raising their hand and verbally communicating in a meeting. It can be, we're going to take your feedback, even if it's written down. You can email me ahead of time if you have questions or you have information you need me to know. It can be something as simple as allowing those multiple forms of communication. Inviting neurodivergent peers to co-facilitate trainings or orientations. This is kind of an important point here because you don't want to necessarily out anybody who is not already out. But if you know of people who are pretty open about having autism or ADHD or sensory processing disorder or what may have you, invite them to have some sort of say when it comes to these trainings and orientations. Get their feedback when it comes to those types of events. And then value lived experience as a form of expertise. The default here should be that people are the experts of their own lives. This is going to be a very important point because we often say, oh, I've not really heard of that particular struggle before. It must not be a big thing to them. But when we talk about neurodiverse experiences, people are their own experts. And so if something is really bothering somebody, trust them, believe them when it comes to that. Collaboration, co-create goals, accommodations, and support plans. So something as simple as being a professor. I often get students who have accommodations in the classroom. I will set up a time to meet with them to say, here's what your paperwork says. Here is what I am legally mandated to do. What else can I do to help you? Is there anything that's not written here that would be beneficial? I can't always do those things, but sometimes I can, and it can be really beneficial to my students. Share decision-making authority when possible. So timelines, formats, pacing. Again, if you are an employee and you're working on some sort of final project, does it have to be a presentation? Could it be an infographic? Could it be a paper? Could it be any number of things? It doesn't always have to be done the way it's always been done. I think that's the important point here. Solicitate ongoing feedback and adapting supports accordingly. So again, when it comes to my own students, I will ask them around midterms. Once they know their midterm grade, I will reach out to my students and say, hey, is there anything else that I can do to help you? Is everything good? Are your accommodations working the way that you were hoping that they would? It can be a little time consuming, but it's definitely time well spent. Treating neurodivergent individuals as experts on their own needs, again, kind of reverting back to the previous point, and then asking what helps rather than prescribing standardized interventions. So asking them, what can I do? What is going to be beneficial? Instead of saying, oh, well, I had a student with autism. I know exactly how to help you. That's not exactly how it is supposed to work. Pillar 5, empowerment, voice, and choice. Offering multiple ways to communicate, participate, or demonstrate competence. Again, allowing students or coworkers or employees to contribute in a variety of ways. Not always possible, but when it is possible, it's very powerful. Allowing choice in how knowledge or competence is demonstrated, again, using a presentation, paper, project, speech, whatever the case may be. Framing accommodations as access tools rather than special treatment. This is something I hear all of the time in higher education. A lot of times people think, oh, well, those accommodations, they just let students get ahead. No, it's creating an equal and equitable start for all of our students. And then finally, dismantling oppressive systems. So this is a really big one. This is probably my favorite pillar out of the 6 of them, which I know is kind of strange to say. Use neurodiversity affirming language. For example, using neurodivergent rather than disordered when appropriate. So for example, knowing that research has shown that for many autistic individuals, they in fact prefer being labeled as autistic rather than someone who has autism. That's not going to be the case for everybody. Everyone's going to have their own preferences, but kind of knowing that ahead of time. Oh, chances are that people may prefer this particular language over this other language. Being aware of neurodiversity related cultural shifts. So, for example, knowing that Autism Speaks is often seen as a hate group for a lot of neurodivergent individuals. I could go into a whole spiel about that, but I won't. Kind of knowing those cultural shifts. It used to be very widely accepted to talk about Autism Speaks, but now it's seen as there's a couple of better groups that we can dedicate our efforts to. Acknowledging that diagnostic criteria and norms are culturally constructed. So, for example, knowing that ADHD and autism are being more commonly diagnosed in women and girls than it was 20 years ago. A lot of people talk about the self-diagnosis epidemic that's going on. A lot of that is based on this idea that people were missed when they were children to be diagnosed with these different conditions. And so knowing ahead of time, oh, well, people might have been missed because of these cultural shifts and being missed because of these culturally constructed ideas of what it means to have ADHD or autism. So that's an important point as well. Attending to racial, gender, and socioeconomic disparities in identification and support access. So again, talking about this idea of, well, if people have this disorder or they have this condition, why don't they just go get diagnosed? It can be very challenging to get diagnosed, especially if you are a racial or sexual minority, especially if you are female, especially if you were missed when you were a child. Something as simple as cost can be a really big barrier for people. Going to get diagnosed with ADHD or autism can cost thousands of dollars, even with insurance. You can be on a wait list for many years, and just knowing those things is going to be very important when working with neurodivergent individuals. And then examining institutional practices that reward conformity over accessibility. So I think back to when I was in undergrad, I had a professor who we had a 3 hour long class once a week. It was very much like a grad class, but it was an undergrad one. And his expectation was you were not to leave the classroom for the entire 3 hours. It doesn't matter what for, it doesn't matter for what reason you are leaving. You're supposed to stay here. You're supposed to stay in the classroom and you're supposed to be engaged. That is one of those things that can be very challenging for neurodivergent individuals and then basically everybody else. That was a very hard policy to have within the classroom. So again, these 6 pillars are not supposed to be this prescription of do this, this, and this, and you're going to be trauma informed and you're going to be behaving appropriately in regard to neurodivergent individuals. This is supposed to be a stepping stone in terms of changing your thinking so that you are um, using these principles to make life a little bit better for every single person who you come across. And I wanted to end with this quote from Temple Grandin. You've probably heard of her before. She's an American academic, inventor, author, and autism advocate. And she is known for saying, "I am different, not less." And I wanted to thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it.
All right, Chelsea, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So it looks like we have some time left. I'd like to open up the channel for any questions that people have or any comments to Chelsea or feedback to Chelsea. Looks like Margaret Hall is raising her hand. Margaret, you can go ahead and unmute, and you can even turn on your camera. Everybody else can turn on their cameras too if they're okay with that.
I will keep my camera off for now. I'm actually about to jump off. I have a 10:45 meeting, so I'm right to the minute. But I just wanted to say first, thank you. This was very informative. I have a son with autism, and I'm actually working with a grant right now to help schools and students be better supported with their mental health. And I was trying to add a something with the grant to help support teachers, support students that may be um, neurodivergent or even, undiagnosed. So I was just
Mhm.
wondering, like, I think all this information right here is great to help, like, provide them with just some insight with how they could be better supportive. And I just wanted to see, are there any other specific ideas that you have for teachers and how they can be, how um, we can help support them in supporting students?
I think that for educators, it's really important to just keep an open mind. Um, I'm immediately taken back to my dissertation a little bit, where we talked about compassionate teaching practices. If you Google compassionate teaching practices, that should take you to a paper by Wolpo et al. I forget the year, but that is also a really good source that I kind of use in this presentation, but not as much because I thought I wouldn't have time. But I think of the compassionate teaching practices as well. I really think that using the six pillars is going to be taking some time to reflect on what that can look like in the classroom and what it can mean for you as an instructor, because what works for you as a teacher may not work for everyone else who's a teacher. And so kind of internalizing, what would this look like in my four walls of my classroom? That could really be quite powerful, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Any other questions or comments from anybody?
Chelsea, I appreciate you reminding us that really taking the trauma-informed pillars and then, like you said, being curious versus like there's a list of strategies that we need to take. So it was really helpful way to be thinking about how we can be with neurodivergent folks wherever our setting is.
Yeah, it's one of those things where when I was first introduced to the pillars many years ago through the SBI, I was like, this isn't very helpful because this is just kind of it's not even like guidelines necessarily. It's not telling me do this, this, and this, and you're going to be trauma informed. But the more I thought about it, the more I was like, maybe that's okay because it's going to look different depending on the situation, depending on who you're working with. I really think that it's good that the pillars are just giving these sort of general suggestions because it's meant to be very individualized. And it's not going to become individualized until you sit with it for a while. It's going to take some time to really understand, what does it mean to be transparent in my classroom? What does it mean to encourage collaboration in my workplace? it's going to be very different depending on who you are.
We got a lot of thank yous in the chat. I was looking to see if we had any other questions. A lot of thank yous and great presentation. So people are appreciative of you being here even as they're being quiet.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.